I grew up on my dad's farm in Illinois, deep in the kind of countryside where the sky feels bigger than anything, where the nights stretch on forever, black and endless. The land has a way of making you feel small out here. And when the wind rolls over the fields at night, carrying the dry rustle of corn stalks whispering to each other, it's easy to start thinking the dark is hiding things. But I was never the type of kid to scare easy. My dad, Tom, made sure of that. He was the kind of man who didn't believe in nonsense. Ain't nothing out there but dirt and crops, he'd say if I ever asked about weird sounds at night. You hear something, it's the wind. You see something, it's in your head. End of story. So when I first saw the eyes, I didn't tell him. I was 11. It was late September, the air still thick with summer heat, but the evenings were cooling down. Harvest was coming, and my dad had been working sunup to sundown, dead on his feet by the time he came inside. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I sat on the edge of my bed, looking out my window at the cornfield stretching out behind our house. A full moon hung low in the sky, turning the world silver. And that's when I saw them. Low to the ground, just above the corn stalks, two glowing eyes stared back at me. Not yellow like a coyote's. Not red like some animal caught in a camera flash. These were pale, almost white, and they didn't flicker or move. Just watched. I sat there frozen, my breath stuck somewhere in my throat. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The eyes didn't go away. I tried to tell myself it was a reflection. A trick of the light. Maybe some piece of metal out there in the field catching the moon. But deep down, I knew better. Then, as if it could hear my thoughts, the eyes disappeared. Not like something running away. More like sinking. Melting into the darkness between the cornstalks. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the field looked normal again, stretching out like it always did, golden and quiet under the rising sun. But something felt different. At breakfast, I finally worked up the nerve to say something. "Dad," I started, watching him sip his black coffee, his hands calloused and cracked from decades of farm work. "Last night I saw." "Ignore them." I blinked. My stomach tightened. "What?" He didn't look up from his plate. Just cut into his eggs, his fork scraping against the ceramic. "You see something in the fields, you ignore it." I stared at him. He wasn't joking. There was no "you're imagining things" speech, no rolling of his eyes. Just those 4 words, flat and firm. And that's when I knew, deep down, that he'd seen them too. But he wasn't telling me everything. I didn't bring it up again after that. Not because I forgot, but because something in my dad's voice told me I didn't want to know the answer. If he, of all people, wasn't willing to explain, then maybe I was better off pretending I hadn't seen anything at all. So that's what I tried to do. For the next few nights, I forced myself to keep the blinds shut, to ignore the urge to look outside. The only problem was, once you see something like that, it doesn't leave your head. I kept thinking about those eyes, pale and patient, sitting out there in the dark. And I kept wondering what my dad knew. Then, one night, something changed. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The old pipes groaned. The fridge hummed. The clock on my wall ticked soft and steady. It was normal. All of it was normal. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, thump. I sat up fast. The sound had come from outside. Not the house. The field. I held my breath, waiting. Thump. Louder this time. Like something heavy moving through the rows of corn. Not an animal. Too deliberate. Too steady. I slid out of bed, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all, but my legs carried me to the window before I could stop them. I hesitated for half a second before pulling the blinds back. And they were there. Closer this time. Not at the edge of the field, but maybe 10 feet from the house. The same pale eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, watching. Unmoving. The air in my chest turned solid. I wanted to scream for my dad, but something in me wouldn't let me. Some deep, instinctual part of my brain told me not to. Told me that if I made a sound, if I moved too fast, something bad would happen. Then the eyes blinked. Not normal blinking. It was slow, too slow, like whatever it was didn't quite understand the motion. And then the thing they belonged to stepped forward. Not fast. Not running. Just a single, careful step. I slammed the blinds shut and backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. A second later, I heard my dad's voice from down the hall. "You looked, didn't you?" I barely had time to process that before he was at my door. Shoving it open, his face set like stone. I'd never seen him look like that before. Not scared exactly, but angry. I swallowed hard, still catching my breath. "Dad, what?" He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the hallway. "Don't ask questions. Just come with me." I barely had time to slip my shoes on before he was leading me downstairs, straight past the front door to the kitchen. He didn't turn on any lights, didn't grab a flashlight, just walked straight to the sink, filled a glass with water, and handed it to me. "Drink it," he said. I hesitated. "What?" "Just do it." I took a sip. It was just regular water. Cool. Tasted like the well water we always drank. I looked up at him in confusion. "Dad, what is this supposed to?" The thump came again, louder, from right outside the kitchen window. I froze. Dad didn't react, didn't even look, just reached for the blinds and pulled them shut. Then he grabbed my wrist, his grip tight. "Go upstairs. Don't look outside again. Not tonight. Not ever." I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off. "You listen to me, boy," he said, voice low and sharp. "You ignore them. If you ever see them again, you go inside. You shut the door. You do not look at them, and you do not speak to them. You understand me?" I swallowed. "But what are they?" For the first time, his expression wavered. A crack in the armor. He looked at the covered window, his grip tightening on my wrist. "They aren't ours to know." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, curled under my blanket like a kid hiding from monsters, my ears straining for any sound outside. For a while, there was nothing but silence. No wind, no crickets, just this eerie stillness, like the whole world was holding its breath. I kept replaying what had happened in my head. My dad had known. He'd known about the eyes, probably for years, and he still wouldn't explain. What did he mean? They aren't ours to know. At some point, exhaustion finally won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But I didn't sleep for long, because something knocked on my window. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I bolted upright, my body instantly coated in cold sweat. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Another knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My blinds were still shut. I couldn't see out, and, God help me, I didn't want to. But somehow I felt them on the other side, waiting. Then, clear as day, I heard it. A voice, a whisper, muffled through the glass. "Come outside." My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't my dad's voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was wrong. Something was off about it. Flat, hollow, like whoever or whatever was speaking had learned the words but not the meaning. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't going to look. I wasn't going to answer. Then the whisper came again, softer this time. "It's safe now." A slow, creeping dread crawled up my spine. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, rushed. A second later, my door flew open, and my dad stormed in. He didn't say a word, just grabbed my arm and yanked me off the bed. Before I could even think to protest, he was dragging me down the hall, his grip like iron. We stopped at the linen closet. He wrenched the door open and shoved me inside. "Stay here," he whispered harshly. "No matter what you hear, you don't come out. You understand me?" I barely managed to nod before he shut the door, leaving me in total darkness. My breathing was ragged, my pulse a wild drum in my ears. I pressed myself against the shelves, surrounded by the smell of detergent and mothballs. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. My dad was scared. I'd never seen him like that before. Not when we lost half a season's crops to a drought. Not when a tornado touched down 2 miles from the house. But now, he was terrified. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the panic clawing up my throat. Then I heard the front door unlock. The hinges creaked as it slowly swung open. For a long, stretching second, there was silence. Then footsteps. Not my dad's. These were lighter, almost delicate. I held my breath. "Tom!" a voice said from the doorway. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my dad's voice. It wasn't mine. It was the same voice that had whispered at my window. "Tom!" it said again. Perfect mimicry. Empty. Echoing. Then I heard my dad's voice. His actual voice. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone firm but shaking at the edges. "Get off my land." A long silence, then a soft, rustling sound, like corn swaying in the wind. "You saw us," the voice said. "The boy saw us, too." I clamped a hand over my mouth. my heartbeat a roaring storm. "You looked," the voice whispered. "You spoke." I could hear the tension in my dad's breathing, like he was holding back something. "Fear? Anger? You've been warned," he said finally. Another long pause. Then the sound of retreating footsteps. Slow, measured, like whoever had come to the door wasn't in a hurry to leave. The floorboards creaked as my dad stepped forward, and after a moment, the door closed. The lock clicked into place. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. My whole body was trembling. Then the closet door opened, and my dad was standing there, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at me. Finally, he whispered, "We can't stay here. We can't stay here." My dad's words hit me like a punch to the gut. I just stared at him, still sitting in that damn linen closet, my legs shaking so bad I didn't think I could stand. The house was silent now, but the air felt thick, heavy, like something was still watching. I swallowed hard. "Dad, who was that?" He didn't answer right away, just rubbed a hand down his face like he was trying to hold something in. Then he turned, walked down the hall, and grabbed his keys off the hook by the front door. "Get your shoes on," he said. "We're leaving." I hesitated. Leaving? But where? Now. I scrambled to my feet. My dad never raised his voice. Never. But there was something raw in it now, something just short of panic. I didn't argue, just threw my boots on and followed him to the truck. The old Ford started up with a shudder, headlights cutting through the darkness. Dad kept glancing at the rearview mirror as we pulled onto the dirt road, like he expected something to be following us. We drove in silence for a while. The road was empty. The night stretched out endless around us. I finally worked up the nerve to speak. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" He didn't answer right away, just kept his hands tight on the wheel. Then finally he exhaled. "I made a mistake." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then he shook his head, jaw tight. "I shouldn't have stayed on that land. My father knew. His father knew. But I thought..." He broke off, his fingers flexing against the steering wheel. "I thought if I ignored it, it wouldn't matter." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Dad, what are they?" He didn't look at me. "I told you, they aren't ours to know." That answer wasn't good enough anymore. I turned in my seat, looking out the back window. The fields stretched out on both sides of the road, miles and miles of tall cornstalks swaying in the night. Something about them made my skin crawl. Then I saw it. The eyes. Not one pair, several, lined up along the edge of the cornfield, just barely visible in the moonlight. Watching, I sucked in a sharp breath. "Dad, I see them," he said. His knuckles were white on the wheel. "Don't look at them." But I couldn't stop. They weren't moving, just standing there. Dozens of them, pale and patient. Too tall for an animal. Too still for a person. The truck rumbled down the road, and the farther we went, the more of them I saw, lined up along the fields, watching. My stomach was a twisted knot of fear. "Where are we going?" Dad exhaled sharply through his nose. "Motel. Then we'll figure it out from there." I nodded, forcing myself to look away from the figures in the field. My head felt light, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But then, the engine sputtered. My heart stopped. The truck jerked once, the headlights flickering. Dad swore under his breath, hitting the gas, but the engine coughed again. The truck slowed. The lights died, and then we were alone in the dark. A thick, suffocating silence filled the cab. My breath came shallow, my hands clenched in my lap. I turned my head, barely breathing, and the eyes were closer. I let out a shaky exhale. "Dad?" His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He turned the key again. The engine whined. Didn't turn over. Another try. Nothing. The night pressed in around us. The corn rustled in the wind, except there was no wind. Then footsteps. Slow. Coming from the road behind us. Crunching on gravel. I turned, my body ice cold. Through the back window, I saw something standing in the middle of the road. Tall, thin, wrong. The headlights were dead, but the moon was bright, casting it in an eerie silver glow. It looked almost human, almost. Then it took another step, and I saw its face, or what should have been a face. There was nothing. No mouth, no nose, just those pale, glowing eyes. Watching. Dad's breathing was sharp and fast now. He turned the key one last time, and by some miracle, the truck roared back to life. The thing in the road didn't move, just tilted its head. Then, just before Dad hit the gas, I heard it. That same hollow voice. Come back. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. My head snapped back against the seat, and when I turned again, it was gone. Not in the road, not in the fields, just gone. We drove the rest of the way in silence. But I knew. This wasn't over. We made it to the motel just after 2 a.m. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, neon sign flickering, a single-story row of rooms with faded green doors, the air thick with the smell of old rain and cigarette smoke. Dad didn't say a word as he parked. Just sat there for a second, gripping the wheel, breathing hard. Then he turned to me. Inside. Now. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. The second we stepped out of the truck, I felt it. That pressure. Like something was watching. Something was waiting. Dad didn't let me hesitate. He grabbed the room key, yanked open the door, and shoved me inside. The second we were both in, he bolted the lock, pulled the flimsy curtains shut, and grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the corner. Then he jammed it under the doorknob. I stood there, my whole body trembling. Dad, they followed us, didn't they? He didn't answer. Just pressed his back against the door, eyes darting around like he expected something to crawl through the walls. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. What do they want? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Doesn't matter. We're not going back. But there was something in his voice that scared me. Like he wasn't sure. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Dad in the chair by the door, me perched on the edge of the bed, my legs drawn up to my chest. The only sound was the low hum of the motel heater. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the phone rang. We both jumped. It was an old motel phone, the kind with big plastic buttons, sitting on the nightstand between the two beds. It rang again. Loud. Mechanical. Wrong. Dad stared at it. Didn't move. Didn't blink. A third ring. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. Don't answer it, I whispered. He didn't. The phone rang one last time, then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then, a knock at the door. I flinched so hard I nearly fell off the bed. 3 soft, deliberate taps. Dad shot me a look so sharp it cut. Don't move, he mouthed. I barely dared to breathe. Another knock. A little louder this time. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice. My voice. Hey, Dad, it said. I nearly choked on air. It sounded exactly like me. The same pitch. The same cadence. A perfect hollow mimic. We should go home, the voice continued. It's safe now. My stomach twisted into knots. Dad's face had gone pale, his hands clenching into fists. He didn't speak. Didn't move. A long silence. Then, from just beyond the door, the doorknob turned. Slowly. Carefully. Testing the lock. The chair under the knob creaked. I shoved my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. A second later, the knob stopped moving. For a long time, there was nothing. Then softly, right up against the wood. They don't let you leave. Cold sweat prickled down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. No more knocks. No more voices. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the motel room. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, waiting. Dad didn't move from the door all night. Neither did I. But I knew one thing for sure. They weren't done with us. We didn't sleep. Dad stayed in the chair, staring at the door like he expected it to burst open at any second. I sat on the bed, knees hugged to my chest, my ears straining for any sound outside. But there was nothing. No more knocks. No more voices. Just the low hum of the motel heater and the occasional creak of the old building settling. And that silence? That's what scared me the most. Because I knew it was the kind of silence that only comes when something is waiting. When the sun finally started creeping through the blinds, Dad let out a long breath. Not relief. Just exhaustion. He ran a hand over his face, then stood up, his movements stiff. Pack your stuff, he said. We're leaving. I didn't argue. I was already pulling on my shoes when I saw it. Something small. Wrong. A single corn husk on the motel carpet. Right by the door. I stared at it, my pulse spiking. I hadn't noticed it last night. but it was there now, pale and brittle, lying just inches from where my dad had been sitting. I swallowed hard. Dad! He saw it too. His whole body went rigid. Neither of us touched it. We just grabbed our bags and got the hell out of there. The road back. We drove. Fast. Dad didn't speak. His hands were tight on the wheel, eyes locked on the road, like if he just focused hard enough, we could outrun whatever this was. But I could feel it. That awful, suffocating pressure. Like something was pressing down on us. Watching. We were about 30 minutes from the motel when I finally spoke. Dad, I said. My voice was thin, shaky. Where are we going? He exhaled sharply. Somewhere safe. I almost laughed. Safe? Safe where? His jaw tensed, but he didn't answer. I stared at him, a sick, twisting fear growing in my gut, because the truth was sinking in, slow and horrible. He didn't know. There was nowhere to go. I turned to look out the window, and my heart stopped. The cornfields were back. I whipped around, my stomach dropping. Dad, I know, he said through clenched teeth. It didn't make sense. We'd been heading away from them, away from home. We were supposed to be hitting highway signs, gas stations, civilization. Instead, endless rows of corn stretched out on both sides of the road. Tall, dark, swaying. We should have been miles away from any fields. But they were here, waiting. My hands were shaking. Dad, how? Then the radio crackled. We both jumped. The static hissed through the speakers, rising and falling in sharp bursts. Dad reached for the knob, trying to turn it off, but the sound just got louder. Then, a voice. Low, hollow, wrong. Come home, I gasped. My dad's hand snapped back from the radio like it had burned him. Turn it off, I choked out. He did, but the second the radio went silent, the engine sputtered. I grabbed the dashboard. No, 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 no. The truck jerked. The headlights flickered. And then, the whole thing died. Dead silence. Dad tried the key. Nothing. The fields pressed in around us. The air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. I looked out the window, and there they were, the eyes, lined up at the edge of the cornfield. More than before. Dozens. Hundreds. Watching. My breath hitched. My whole body was ice. Dad grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron. Don't look at them. But I couldn't move, couldn't think. Because one of the things was stepping onto the road. Tall, thin, pale. It didn't walk like a person. It glided. And then, it spoke. Come home. Perfect, hollow copy of my dad's voice. My throat closed. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. Then, a tap on my window. Soft, deliberate. I whimpered. Dad grabbed my arm. Don't move, he whispered. Don't open your eyes. Don't speak. I listened, because I knew if I acknowledged them, they'd never let me go. The taps continued. Then, through the glass, I heard my own voice. Open the door. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. Come home, it said again. Then, the passenger door unlocked. Click. I lost it. I screamed, scrambling away from the door, trying to shove myself into the center of the truck. Dad lunged for the handle, relocking it, but something pulled. The door shook. Once, twice, harder. The whole truck rocked. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The pressure in the air vanished. The silence was crushing. My whole body was trembling. I turned my head, pulse roaring in my ears. The eyes were gone. So was the thing in the road. Just an empty stretch of pavement and silent fields. The truck roared to life. Dad didn't question it. He threw it into gear, hit the gas, and we peeled out of there so fast my head snapped back against the seat. We didn't stop. Not for food. Not for gas. Not until we were 2 states away. But even then, I knew they weren't done with us. Not yet. We didn't go home. We didn't go anywhere we knew. Dad drove for 2 days straight. No stops except for gas and food, always in cash. No credit cards, no cell phones. He said they could track us that way. I didn't ask him how he knew. We found another motel, different state, middle of nowhere. We checked in under fake names. And for the first time in years, Dad let me see him cry. The plan. We can't run forever, I told him. He nodded. I know. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together, his fingers shaking. You said you ignored them, I said, for years, and they left you alone. He looked up at me, his eyes red. I was wrong. I swallowed hard. So what do we do? He didn't answer right away, just looked out the motel window at the empty parking lot, the cracked asphalt glowing orange under the flickering street lamp. Then he said, we go back. The return. We left before dawn. I don't know if we were running toward something or if we just realized there was nowhere else to run. The road stretched long and empty before us, the kind of lonely highway where you don't see another car for miles. And then it started again. The radio, the static cut in, warping and twisting, rising in volume. Dad tried to turn it off. It wouldn't. Then came the voices. Our voices. But they weren't coming from the speakers. They were outside the car. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms. Don't stop, I whispered. Dad's grip tightened on the wheel. I won't. The voices followed us, whispering, murmuring, crawling under my skin like something rotting. Then, a figure appeared in the road. Tall, thin, pale, not human, not even close. Dad didn't slow down. We sped toward it, and just before we hit it, it vanished. But the second we passed through where it had been standing, the truck died. Everything shut off. The engine, the lights, the radio, dead silence. The truck coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. I didn't move, neither did Dad. We just sat there, staring out at the cornfields. They were waiting. The eyes were back, hundreds of them, peering out from between the stalks, watching. I reached for the door handle, and Dad's hand clamped over mine. No, my breath hitched. But we don't go to them. His voice was barely a whisper. We don't answer. We don't look. I swallowed hard. Then what do we do? Dad didn't answer, because the door locks clicked open. Click, 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 all at once. My stomach turned to ice. Then softly, right outside the window, a whisper. Come home. I squeezed my eyes shut. Something was moving outside, gliding closer. I felt it lean in. The air went thick. Then, the truck roared back to life. Dad hit the gas. The tires screeched as we tore out of there, the truck fishtailing onto the road. I risked one last glance at the mirror. The cornfield was empty. No eyes, no figures, just still swaying stalks, like nothing had ever been there. The truth. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Not until we were miles away, the sun creeping up over the horizon. Then Dad said, we don't talk about this again. I turned to him, my heart still hammering. But we don't talk about it, he repeated. We don't think about it. We just move on. I knew what he was really saying. If we acknowledge them, they'll come back. So I nodded, and we never spoke of it again. But they never left. That was 10 years ago. I moved across the country, built a life far away from that farm. But sometimes, late at night, I'll look out my window, and I swear I see them. Not always, just for a second. A flicker of something in the dark. Pair of glowing eyes watching, waiting. I pretend I don't see them. I ignore them, but deep down, I know the truth. You can't outrun them. You can't escape. They never let you leave.